Evening, everybody. If I'll start with a little bit of an introduction and background as to who I am, and also the who the project team are in Swaffham Prior, so you can get a feel for how different, or actually, really, how similar um, uh, uh, your team is to our team. Actually, it feels like. Um, I'm an environmental consultant. I'm an ecologist by training. I spent a couple of years working for a Danish firm while in Cambridge, and part of that work was investigating district heating market in the UK, trying to bring Danish technology across to do heating schemes, and that gave me a really good background as to how the technology works and how the Danes are doing it quite successfully and have been doing it successfully since the 1980s. Um, and following on from that, um, really the scheme in Swaffham Prior grew out of an idea and a conversation in the way that you usually do. We were sitting, Emma and I, the other director of the Community Land Trust, were having a glass of wine in my kitchen while all our kids were watching a movie and eating pizza. And I was moaning about the oil tank in my garden because it's really big and it's ugly and it's in the wrong place and I can't really do anything about it. And we were talking about district heating and stuff like that. And I did say, oh yeah, and there are grants for this sort of thing. We could just apply for some money and do a system in the village. And we thought, yeah, of course we could. And it's like, and actually the next day I thought about it and I thought, well, actually we could just apply for a grant. And the Rural Community Energy Fund grants, which is the first phase that you would apply for. Actually, it's a really simple system, and they have oodles of cash that they are desperate to get rid of. So actually, they are really helpful in the energy hub that you've been in contact with already, the project team, um, in assisting and putting that together. And so, although time is short, actually, it's entirely doable to get an application in by May, I would have thought, for the first phase grant. And so, what following that conversation in the kitchen, Emma and I, who are both on the Community Land Trust, we'd been poking around looking for something else for the Community Land Trust to do. Emma had just finished building a bunch of social housing in the village, 8 houses, and was feeling a bit pumped up for the next project. And this was nearly 3.5 years ago now. And so we put an application in, not really expecting to get the money, and we did. And then it was a question of, for 3 years, several grant applications, and a series of studies to take us to the point where we are now. And the first study was really just proof of concept, that it is possible to put a scheme like this and retrofit it into houses in a village. And that's the sort of thing that really hasn't been done on a big scale in the UK at all. Um, most district heating schemes are built for new build, and they're put in as the houses are built. Retrofitting into people's houses is tricky because you need everyone to let you drill holes in their houses and do all sorts of stuff, and it's just a bit complicated. And it's been in the government's too hard to do pile for years and years. And actually, one of the reasons we've had so much support from BEIS and central government is because actually this scheme, and your scheme, if you do it, solves a real problem that they don't really have a solution for at the moment. And that is how to decarbonize heat, and reduce carbon in the domestic environment, particularly where people are not on gas. So even if they had a solution around gas, it wouldn't solve our problems around our homes because we're on oil. So after successfully getting the first grant, the second grant was we could only allocate it if we had a local authority partner. Unfortunately, we have a really good proactive county council who have a renewables team who are looking at putting in solar and other things all over the county, and they were really happy to pick the project up and run it with us and on our behalf. And so they applied with us for the second round of grant money, and subsequently for grant money after that. And that allowed us to do two things. It made it possible for us to access money beyond the Rural Community Energy Fund, and it also allowed us to appoint a consultant team, a professional team, to do all the project management and do all the specialist stuff that we need. So we've got project engineers, we've got planning consultants, everything basically in the core team who are helping us deliver the project. And we went, it's taken a long time to get there, but the first questionnaire we had 164 out of 300 houses give us a positive result in terms of an expression of interest that they would be interested potentially in connecting. And that was enough of a confidence to allow BEIS to release the last tranche of money for us to then drill a test borehole. And that was the other technical query they really had. They our scheme, and I might just share my screen if I may. I think I can. So this is I'm not able to. It doesn't matter. Okay, I can read it out. I'll read it out in a minute because it'll only distract you perhaps. So we did a test borehole because basically our scheme is going to be half of the heat is going to come from a ground source heat pump, which will be a series of 130 boreholes, which are drilled down through the chalk that we're sitting on into the green sand, and it absorbs water from the aquifer. No, sorry, it absorbs heat from the aquifer, but there's no exchange. It's closed loop, so there's really hardly any risk of pollution at all. And what's in the pipe that goes down and comes up is just brine. So even if there was a leak, it wouldn't be polluting in any sense. And so there's 130 boreholes, and there's also a series of 2 air source heat pumps, big industrial air source heat pumps, which are bespoke engineering coming over from Denmark, which is why they're quite expensive. So we've got 0.5 of a megawatt of air source and 1.5 megawatt of ground source, and that gives us enough so that we can fill the thermal stores we have. We have 4 thermal stores, and they also have the capacity to work as enormous kettles, so you can switch them on and they will also heat the water, and that is also a backup for us. So if for any reason the ground source or the air source heat pumps didn't work, we could use the thermal stores as an electric generator of heat into the water in any case. And the plan is that we'll run a private wire from our energy centre just outside the village to a solar farm that the county council are developing. So the county council will be selling its electricity to its own energy centre at a good discount, so much cheaper than we would be able to buy it from the grid. And that then allows us to put a network in, a mixture of soft dig and hard dig through the village. And actually, most of the concern that we've had in the village in terms of the scheme is mainly about the disruption, and it's mostly about the disruption of the network. People are concerned about how we're going to dig the roads up, how we're going to put them back, how long will that take, will it all happen at once, will it be noisy, what sort of mess will there be? And that actually is probably the key thing that you need to address. And there will be disruption. You know, it will be temporary, but there will be disruption. And the idea is really to manage that process. And the engineers are looking at programming it in so that we've got the right approach so that it doesn't drag out too long, but we're not closing all the roads all at once. So that there's always a way in and a way out of the village. So we went for planning in summer last year. It got approved in November. It was pretty much unopposed, so hardly any objections. We had 2 or 3 objections. A couple of the neighbours near the boreholes were concerned about construction noise, quite rightly. But the boreholes are drilled, they're not compaction, so there's not a lot of noise there. And once it's all done, actually there's hardly anything above ground for the ground source heat pump. It just looks like a field. And the energy centre is located in an old barn, which we're converting, again on county council land. And the county council has been a key partner for us. And as I understand it, Cherwell district are going to be a key partner for you. And actually Cherwell have pretty good reputation nationally in terms of this sort of project already. So actually, I think you're in a really good place in terms of having a partner like Cherwell to rely on. The only other thing I would say is that we had a couple of principles that we wanted to extend to make sure that the scheme was really a community scheme. And we wanted to make sure that we were connecting all of the housing association houses that we could. And so there's some grant money through Green Homes for converting some of the housing association homes that are on electric heat storage. They don't have a wet radiator system, but using the Green Homes grants, we can convert them and put wet radiators into those homes in advance of connecting to the district heating. The other things we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that there was no upfront capital cost for people in the village connecting. So it's when we're building it, if it's free to connect, basically at that point, there will be a charge if people don't connect now, but decide they want to connect in 2 or 3 years' time, because there's some engineering costs. We'll need to come back and do some extra work. But if they sign up now, there's no upfront cost at all. Also, the scheme includes decommissioning and removing the old boilers, the old oil boiler, and also the old oil tank. If people have a fairly new boiler they've just put in, like a year or 2, it's got a long life to go, there's a possibility that they may well sell it on instead of scrapping it, and that's fine. But if they don't want to sell it on, they don't want the hassle, the scheme will pick it up and take it away. And same with the oil tank as well. And then they'll come in and put the heat exchangers in the place where the boiler was. And the other principle really is that it needs to be cheaper than oil. It's designed so that it will be cheaper than oil. That's the plan. And I probably don't want to say anymore, and I've probably rattled on for too long, but it's taken us 3 years to get to where we are. The plan is that there'll be a spade in the ground in May, all things being equal. That's the plan. You guys should be able to do it in at least half the time, maybe a bit less, hopefully.
Mike, thank you. That's been incredibly helpful. I see there's been a few questions coming in. So one question we had right at the start was sort of how soon could you do it? So I think less than 3 years is one answer. Maybe a lot less than 3 years is another. Daniel, you asked about the level of interest. So I think we've had 89 expression of interest, sort of clicks or bits of paper through the letterbox so far out of 165 households in the in the village or within the parish council. So we've had, sorry, I'm just going to the chat so that I can try to pick everything up. Deborah Jones asked if you need a backup heating system with this. And Nigel, I mean, maybe that's one for you, if I may. But I think really the message that we've talked about with you and some others is that the precise system that we end up getting here will very much depend on Upper Hayford and everything around it. But maybe you can just expand on that particular point.
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question, and one where, I mean, heat pumps have been around for a long time, certainly in Europe, but I think Retherm installed its first borehole in Wimbledon in 2007, and individual houses very rarely have a backup system. So the technology works. In a scheme which is as big as the Swaffham Prior one, yes, it may be wise to have a backup system. There are eventualities on a scheme that big that could happen, that don't happen on a localised domestic situation. If I talk about North Aston particularly, there is no backup system there. We have a disaster recovery plan that if something does happen, there is a way, but there is no inbuilt backup system. So I think as technology moves on and as the district heating systems become more mainstream, dare I say, then I think that the need for backup systems will probably reduce.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. Deborah, does that answer your question? Or if you're feeling shy, that's fine, and we'll move on. So there's then a question around boreholes, and so I think again the system at Swaffham Priors is the system at Swaffham Priors, and we may end up with a different system. So if effectively what we're talking about here is a series of pipes going through the village that take heated water to everyone's houses, and that's the heat network. There is then a heat source, and that heat source, it could be the ground source that Mike was talking about. It could be the air source that Mike was talking about. We've got a river at the bottom of the valley, and though I'm not an engineer, I understand that you can have a water source as well. And so whether we need boreholes or not is very much still to be decided. I think it's fair to say that the scheme at North Aston, that's using boreholes, but they're in the ground, they're sunk, they're covered by what looks like very large manhole covers, and then it seems as though that field can then go back to agricultural use. So just to pick up that particular question from Anne. And then, sorry, I was just going through. But yeah, Chris O'Malley asked the question is, if we had boreholes, and that is an if, then where might that be? Sorry, I need to give that to someone.
I'm not sure we know that yet, do we? In terms of the location of things, I think that's very much for that's why we're applying for this first survey. Chris, do you want to say something?
I was just going to add to what you've just said, Charlie. I think that we're learning as we go. We're blessed that we've got 3 experts with us, and what we've already learned from a number of the people we've talked to, including the people on this call, is that, as Andy said, there's a broad source of energy that we can look at, and exactly what we end up with, we will not know at this point. That's why we want the grant, and that's why we'll then do the research. And the research will do 2 things. It will look at what possible sources of energy we might have, the nature of the backup, which was mentioned, and that could be gas. With a village of this size, we're blessed that we do have a gas main coming down from Camp Road, so that could be our backup energy source. And then the other element it does is it looks at each individual home and each individual home's energy need. And that's what we'll then get out of our first phase grant.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Paul Weaver's asked an interesting question about Hayford Park, and maybe ask you to pick that one up, Chris, just because, Chris Coe, that is, because I know you've had a conversation in relation to Hayford Park, and I think that's in the context of the fact that they can't install any new gas boilers from 2025 onwards, isn't it?
Sam, may I pass that
Yeah.
one quick to you?
No, that's yeah. So the installers at Hayford Park, Dorchester Group, I've had conversations with them around heat networks for the better part of about 5-6 years, on and off, mainly in relation to the heat network work that was going on in Bicester, and if there was opportunities around the ERF, the energy from waste plant. There is interest, but to date they haven't responded to the emails that we put to them. My colleagues in the planning major developments team will be picking up with them in due course when they have meetings, making them very much aware. I think that there is an opportunity to explore something, but my experience of working with developers on heat networks is that there's a timing situation in terms of them going through the planning applications and when they're serious for development, and really when they're gearing up to putting the planning application in and conducting their energy statements, which effectively sets out how they're going to be building the development going forward. That's the point at which they seriously engage. From experience of working on heat networks with developers, there is a real risk that if you wait for the developers, you could be waiting for a very long time. And so from speaking to Chris, my recommendation would be to proceed almost with a plan A and a plan B. And once something's going ahead, if there's an opportunity for Dorchester to engage, then potentially engage on that front. But with the opportunity to build the study purely looking for the village, so that if Dorchester and the Hayford Park development isn't able to be incorporated, you've still got a project to take forward.
Sam, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Andy, whether Nigel would be able to answer a couple of questions.
Yeah,
You're all right
sure,
to do that, Nigel. There's
I will
one.
try my best.
There's one from Anna, sorry, which says, "I have gas central heating. Is there any truth that we sometimes hear, which is alternative heating is not as warm as gas central heating?"
Very simply, if it's not been designed properly, yes. If it's been designed properly, there is no question that renewable heat sources can be as effective as gas or oil.
And then there's one from Heather, and Heather, I have to confess, I am also sort of a little bit stuck on what the heat transfer units or the HC units look like. I think we don't know that yet, but Nigel might be able to help us a little bit more. Heather's question is, I'm still at a loss as to what the HC units that replace individual boilers actually do. The heated water arrives at the property at a temperature equivalent to what the boiler produces. So what does it do?
Oh, good, great question. And let's try and answer that very succinctly. The best way to do it, I would suggest, is there's a few explainer videos on YouTube, which will do a way better job than I can. But fundamentally, a plate heat exchanger takes heat from one source. It then basically creates it in an accelerative liquid or gas, or liquid that turns to gas, which raises the pressure, which then basically produces heat because it's condensed and pressurized, and that heat is extracted within the system to then produce water. That's typically the way a heat pump will work, which is an extension of a heat exchanger. Very simplistic, but there's plenty. I can send links to a few places on YouTube that will explain in greater detail, not so much successfully than I've just done.
Nigel, just to add to your description, I think putting it in my own simplistic terms, because I'm quite a simple bloke, essentially it's a series of interlocking pipes that put one heat from the main system into the heating of the building, and they're typically the sort of size of a gas boiler in terms of what space it would occupy in terms of the building. Sorry, Nigel, just jump in there.
No, absolutely, no problem.
If I could add a little bit, because that's obviously one of the key questions that we've also faced, and basically it's smaller than an oil boiler by about half, more or less. So it's a sort of kitchen cupboard size. if you've got a gas boiler, it's about that sort of size. And as Nigel said, it basically is a heat exchange between one system and another, so that there's no fluid change, just the heat that moves between one set of pipes to another set of pipes.
Okay,
We're going to put lots of geeky videos on our website, so you can all watch them. Chris and I have been watching loads, haven't we, Chris? There's another question, Mike, while we've got you, is I just wanted to kind of tag on with a question from Chris about, is it cheaper than oil? Is it cheaper than gas? Is it cheaper than electric? What are we looking at?
So our scheme, because of the boreholes, is quite expensive. And I think by the time you guys get to market and look to buy this sort of kit, it should come down in price. What we're finding is that we're having to go to Denmark to buy the air source heat pumps because nobody sells them here in any quantity. So it's complicated. But I think by the time you get there, it will be cheaper. Our scheme is designed to be cheaper than oil, but we're having some difficulty in actually pinning what the price of oil is, because obviously it fluctuates a lot. When we started this 3 years ago, it was very expensive, and then it got really cheap, and then it's got really expensive, and now it's really cheap again. And so we do need to peg it at a sensible point, and we need to agree that with central government because they're funding it. But it will be cheaper. It will be cheaper than oil. That's the design principle that we've set out to achieve.
And Nigel, sorry, Andy, can I suggest you also just give us your insight on this really sort of quite important question, and maybe just give your assessment of the Swaffham scheme, because as Mike has just said, that started 3.5 years ago, and technology is changing almost by the month at the moment.
Yeah, okay, quite a big question there, Chris. Deal with it small, but the first thing in terms of cost, if you look at the efficiency of a typical heat pump, be it air or ground or water, you're typically getting 3 units or 3 to 4 units of energy for 1 unit of input. So take that very simply, put 1 unit of electricity in, you get 4 units of heat out. You compare that to gas, which depends, it's around about 80% efficient. So if your design is right and the heat pump is efficient, or the scheme is efficient, then it is 1/3 of the price of a gas situation. But at the moment, gas is about between 1/3 and 1/4 of the price of electricity. So it is about economics of electrification of heat. There's a movement centrally to move towards electrification, because clearly we're not going to hit 2050 net zero if we carry on burning fossil fuels to heat homes, amongst other things. So commenting directly on the Swaffham scheme, I mean, they were breaking new ground 3 years ago. We've come in, and the difference between North Aston and Swaffham is a fundamental difference apart from size, in that the properties that we're putting heat interface units into, which is a little bit what we talked about, they're tenanted properties, and therefore there wasn't a need necessarily to get the buy-in from individual and private owners. So it's been a bit easier. I've sent some images over just to satisfy or help in looking at, we've since stepping out from the groundworks, which are now complete, 3 months ago, you'd be hard pressed to see where the heat mains are in. But the point about Swaffham, it's a difficult one, because you've got to encourage people who don't know, most people don't know that much about heat pumps and renewable technology, and convince them that there is a better way than having 70 to 80 degrees centigrade of hot water rushing around the house. I did one point here. I'm used to Central Europe, and you turn a tap on there, they don't have mixer taps. Why on earth do you boil water or heat water to 80 degrees and then add cold water to it? Where's the sense in that, if you think about it?
There's another sort of observation just in relation to the various conversations that we've been having. And it was a question, actually, I think Roger asked Andy, didn't he? Roger from Somerton Road. And he just couldn't quite understand why, if all of the capital's paid for, why it was only 15% cheaper than oil. And what's just been touched upon is the fact that you've got to use electricity effectively to generate your heat. So another thing that we would want to consider, I think, as part of the research is, well, can we source cheaper electricity? Could we source solar energy for our own scheme? Because anything we can do to reduce the energy input into the scheme will reduce the ongoing running costs. So again, there's a huge amount for us to give consideration to in the research phase. So that's the only other observation that I wanted to make.
Sure. Just to jump in there, I think, Chris, you've touched upon that in terms of the energy costs going forward as well. So, I mean, the other aspect as well is the large costs of heat networks are the pipes that go in the ground, and typically their lifespan is a good 30, 40 years. So a large amount of the infrastructure is those associated with those pipes. Oxfordshire has a couple of advantages over what's happening in Cambridgeshire. So some of you may be familiar with the Local Energy Oxfordshire project, which is essentially moving towards smart grids and smart testing, or sorry, Scottish and Southern electricity networks are testing some smart grid controls around Oxfordshire. And so there are opportunities around sleeving and having cheaper renewable electricity arrangements with local generators. So there is some opportunities to integrate that system going forward as well.
Thanks, Sam.
Can I pick up on a couple of questions that are still? There was a question around temperature and temperature coming into the house, and actually that's been a real perennial question that we've faced, really, because the typical domestic air source heat pump, if you bought one, would only deliver you about 40, 45 degrees heat coming in. Whereas we've made sure that we've engineered it so the Swaffham Prior scheme will work with wet radiators without being adapted in any way. So the radiator systems in people's homes are designed to run on hot water from oil boilers, so they're about 70 degrees. And so we're planning to make sure that the heat in the network is running at 70 or 75 degrees. So when it gets to the properties, it's 72 degrees. So it will be exactly the same as if you're running off a boiler, basically.
So we'll need mixer taps.
Presumably you have mixer taps.
Yeah, no. I just wanted to pick up on a point that that was made about the roads. Stuart, I think you made one about private roads. I think the importance of the scheme and the success of a scheme like this hinges on the fact that it's energy for all. So of course we'd kind of be looking at going into private roads and sort of linking up to everybody who wants. And I think Mike mentioned that they put in infrastructure, so there was the possibility of people connecting in the future as well. So it's thinking kind of present day, but also future proofing it as well, so that if the main heat center doesn't work for any reason, eventually in 15 years, we realize that air source heat pumps aren't the way forward and we want to go for something else, we can change that without having to change the infrastructure of the village. There's also one other point that Daniel made about interest. And at the moment, we actually have 92 people who've completed our survey and who are interested. Nobody's said no so far. And we've only been going 2 weeks, so there's still a lot of doors to knock on. But the plan to say 100 homes are interested and the others are not, I think there's a minimum number of interest, but I think for the feasibility survey, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, this is just the initial stage, so we're just canvassing interest. I don't. Yeah.
And Daniel, is your question around how many people need to be signed up at the point at which people start putting spades in the ground? Because I wonder if Mike Barker, you might want to pick that one up.
So, I mean,
yeah. Okay.
So yeah, we had a questionnaire very early on that gave us 164 out of about 300 as expressions of interest. We've not really had anyone really say they're not interested. It's like most people are either interested or disinterested, and neither one way or the other. But in terms of sign up, I would say for early stage 90, and not a return of 90 is positive. And the fact that you've got 90 returns and they're almost all positive, that's extraordinary, really. And that will be more than enough, I would have thought, for the initial grant phase that you're going for, because the grant money is to allow you to engage with the community. That's what it's for. So to actually have done that before you've even got the grant, and to have 90 people already signed up is really good, actually, I would have thought. I noticed a question about fibre broadband, and just to say, because I didn't before, we are looking to drop fibre broadband into the network as we put it in, potentially. We haven't quite signed the deal on that, but that's something that we are looking at. So, in terms of the village, what it will mean is there'll be fibre all the way to people's houses, which is extraordinary given our Wi-Fi situation in the village is diabolical at the moment.
Thanks, Mike. I don't. I'm just trying to interpret Daniel's question. Just make sure it's sort of answered. So you've got 165 people who've sort of signed the contract, and was there a threshold, if you like, around that, and also what are you doing about that, people who haven't signed up but might want to sign up in future?
So there's 3 steps actually in our process. So we've had the 164 expressions of interest, which is great. That was a year or maybe even 18 months ago. Since then, we've been doing house by house surveys, and because of COVID over the last year, we're having to do them online. And that is basically an engineer will sit with the householder, look at Google Earth, look at their land holding, work out where the network is, work out which route would go in and where it would come in to the house, where their boiler is, and just the practicalities of, will it come in through the drive, will it come in through the back garden, and just talk people through that process. We've had about coincidentally about 90 or 100 surveys done. They've all been pretty positive. But what we haven't done yet is give anyone in the village the final heat agreement to sign. So we haven't finalised the contract because we haven't fixed the tariff. And because we haven't fixed the tariffs, we can't actually get people to sign up. So at the moment, we're in this sticky position where we've got planning, but we haven't signed anyone up to the scheme. But what we need to do very quickly over the next 4 or 5 weeks is get everyone signed up once we fix the tariff.
Right, Daniel, you've got your hand up, I think.
Just to clarify, the question is more, a village of our size, let's say 100 houses sign up to it. Is there anything detrimental to those people who don't sign up to it and just don't want to? Nothing to do with whether they sign up in the future, and a time in the future, just in terms of any implications of their energy supply going forward. That's my question.
I mean, I can answer that in terms of our village, and then maybe we can extrapolate from there. We're basically designing it for probably 200 homes, so 2/3 of the homes. So we're not expecting everybody to sign up. There is a little bit of headroom in case extra people do sign up, but actually it's been designed for 200 homes, not 300 homes. We could design it for 300 homes, but we don't see the point. It just make it more expensive for everyone else. But what that does mean at some point, and that some point is pretty much now, because we're just about to buy all the kit. If everybody else suddenly decides, the other 100 people decide they want to join the scheme, actually, there is a point where fundamentally they can't. unless we buy another piece of kit and we extend out, and that's another project. But you know, if people don't sign up, they can still buy oil, or if they're on gas, because some of the village are on gas already, you know, that's fine, and that will just continue until the government decides that you can't be on gas or can't be on oil, and they bring in some punitive tariffs or something to stop people doing that, and that will eventually happen. But I think we're a little way off that at the moment.
Thanks, Mike. Janet, you had a question and you've been waiting very patiently around air source heat pump and solar panels, and whether this scheme would be of any use given you've already got those renewable heat sources available to you. I don't know who wants to pick that one up.
I can. Sorry, go ahead, Charlie. Go ahead, Charlie.
Well, no, I just like to say, like, well, amazing. She's probably the most environmentally friendly house in our village. So congratulations. Over to you.
I guess it would depend on the performance currently of the system you've got, and whether the district system can add any benefits. I mean, clearly if it doesn't, then no, stick with what you've got because it is renewable.
Thanks, Nigel. I just wanted to come back to this question about the private roads. The question is whether there'd be a sort of extra cost for the connection to the private road. Sam, I don't know if that's anything that you've come across.
It shouldn't be in theory. It's more of the legal negotiations and the costs associated with that. So when you're dealing with our highways, it's one partner just dealing with them. When there's a lot of different private roads, there's a series of way-leave agreements and legal negotiations that need to take place. So that's where the additional costs come in predominantly. But yeah, so without sort of giving you an answer, I suppose that's the answer I can provide. Sorry.
But I think the idea with any scheme like this is that cost would be shared in the scheme, rather than necessarily saying, oh, just because you live on that particular road, then you've got to pay something and nobody else has got to pay anything. And that seems to be the approach in Swaffham, is that there is a cost of a scheme, and that is grant funded from central government in terms of what's going on at the moment. And if you've got a slightly different configuration for whatever reason, then that doesn't matter, because that's covered in the cost of the scheme from all the surveys that have been going on. And that's really the beauty of this kind of arrangement. Question from Chris O'Malley: does the village grid only supply hot water, or could it be used to generate an alternative source of electricity? Who wants to pick that one up?
Could take that if you want. There's several ways, and again, the technology is not determined for the village in terms of which will be the best solution. There's one solution. This is very unlikely, but it is possible, where we have an ambient service, but that requires homes to be almost passive, and the amount of installation required would probably be prohibitive. So that probably rules that one out. The fourth generation, as it's called, is what we've got at North Aston. That supplies only basically heating, and the system within the property will then generate hot water. There is another way of doing it, which is a district heat main and a district hot water main. So you've got two systems running concurrently, one supplying domestic hot water and the other one just supplying heating. It's really going to depend on a number of factors, number of properties, size of properties, and I would probably add here, the most difficult thing to get right in any system is your hot water supply. If you can fix your hot water supply, heating is not an issue, because hot water, if everybody turns their shower on at the same time, the same point every day, you've got massive demand for short bursts of time at very high energy. So if you can fit, so long story short, there is a possibility. We're doing some small district heating systems now where we're putting heat mains in alongside hot water mains. But it depends on the technology that's eventually determined for the village. And it may be a combination. It could be air source, water source, boreholes, and horizontal loops in the ground. It just depends on the amount of area, the heat that's needed, and that can only be determined by individual audits of properties and use of hot water. Sorry, long answer. But
can I add to that,
Nigel.
just to say
Yeah,
that
go on, Mike.
we very early on we were thinking about combined heat and power and electricity generation as well, maybe with biomass. Our village wouldn't thank us for building a big biomass plant outside of the village, so we knocked that one on the head really quite quickly. We also discounted a really big solar array in terms of solar PV, because they wouldn't countenance us doing that. We certainly wouldn't be putting a wind turbine up because they would have kittens if we did that. So we've avoided the electricity question. We did talk about putting ducts in for perhaps retrofitting private wire at some point, but actually at the moment it's so complicated, we've stepped back from that, and I don't know that we would ever come back to it in any time soon, frankly.
Thanks, Mike.
Andy,
Yeah.
So yeah, there's quite a few questions about solar energy that have been popping up from a number of people. I think started by Heather. And again, I suppose two things to say. Courtesy of Derek, we've had some very positive initial discussions with the Allotment Society. So we're sponsored by the Parish Council, but the Allotment Association rather have shown us an initial support for the scheme. But they quite rightly have lots of questions to ask. So we're going to be having a discussion with them to see what their concerns or issues or ideas might be. But I think at this point, what we should be trying to say is, if we can reduce the energy input, and that's electricity, and we can do that in an environmentally and ecologically friendly way, and we've got space available to do so, and we are blessed with a substantial amount of space available to the village, then I think we should be looking at it. And that's why I think Derek quite rightly is suggesting that we have an initial conversation with the Allotment Society to see what their thoughts are. So again, it's keeping all options open is critical. And then the other very specific thing, Nigel, which you just touched on, is around how you get the heat energy up to the level of the required level of an individual house. And again, technology is improving a lot, I think. And I think you've mentioned about heat pumps that can provide additional heat for an individual property. Is that something worth touching on?
Yeah, it is. I'm going to go back to the point. So to answer the point on solar first, it is very relevant, because solar's great when the sun's shining, and that's not necessarily the time when you are demanding heat because it's cold. So just to put that into very simple terms, you need hot water, and you need hot water all the year round, but you need heating when it's dark and it's wet and it's cold and it's the middle of December, not when you're getting too much solar. So solar's been talked about to work hand in hand with renewable energies ad infinitum. It's not quite as simple as it seems. It can work. Battery technology is not quite there in terms of cost and efficiency and expense. I think it's coming, but working with some of the major energy providers, like I've forgotten the name of them now, I'm with them myself, but they offer heat pump tariffs. And you can use things like, and it's been touched on by Mike in relation to heat stores and thermal stores, about heating it when it's low cost energy. So late at night, or when basically there's a surplus of energy and it has been known to be negative cost, and thermal store, and then use that when it comes to peak by pumping the water into homes. There's many ways you can do it, and the technology is moving very quickly. To answer your question about heat pumps at individual properties, this tends to work on 5th generation circuits, and this is where you've got ambient flow, so it might be 14 degrees in the pipe serving the properties, and each property has a heat pump or a heat interface unit, whether it be most likely be a heat pump rather than it tend to be a sort of ground source type heat pump, where you're pumping water in at an ambient temperature and then using the compressors to increase the temperature that's required in the properties. I mean, some heat pumps will stick out 75, 80 degrees, but they tend to be more expensive. They're using very hot propane and gases like that as refrigerant. I'm starting to get way too technical. Again, stretching the limits of my knowledge, so I'll coil back a bit. But ambient is probably difficult on the basis that it is for passive homes, and passive homes have got a heat loss typically of about 30 watts per metre. If you look at a property which is very thick walls, well, sometimes they can be good heat stores, But if you've got cavity and there's no cavity, so say pre-1950, then you could be at 150 watts per square meter heat loss. And simplistically, you've got to put 150 watts in to maintain a balance of 0 in terms of loss. So that's the sort of magnitude of determination by engineers looking at heat loss of a building, windows, walls, floors, ceilings, before they can determine the right type of technology, which is why the audits have been done at Swaffham in the way they have been done.
Thanks, Nigel. So there's a question from the Morgan Harris's, which is around the impact on house value. Obviously, this is all new technology, and people are probably used to having a gas boiler or an oil boiler when they buy a house, and if they walk in and there's a heat interface unit or something other newfangled, is there any evidence that this kind of system would reduce the value of houses or make them more difficult to sell?
So
Go on, Mike.
Sorry, Mike. I'll jump in after you.
Yeah. So we've had similar sorts of questions, but to be honest, actually, our view is that house prices in Swaffham Prior are depressed anyway, because everyone's on oil, and nobody really wants to be on oil if they can help it. Everyone would rather be on gas because they know gas, and gas is efficient. And oil is a bit smelly, and you have to have a tank, and you have to fill it up. And if you forget to fill it up, then you have to have it all drained and everything. It's a real hassle. And we think that there is going to be an uplift in the village on house prices when we put the scheme in, because people have a choice not to be on oil suddenly. But we don't have any proof that that's the case. It's anecdotal, but I've been in the village for 5 years, and we were put off initially because it had an oil tank, and I've been trying to get rid of the oil tank ever since I got here. So it shouldn't depress houses. It probably will lift them up, but I guess so. Maybe it'll meet in the middle and not have an effect. We don't really know.
Yeah, just building on Mike's point, really, there's essentially not enough knowledge within the country about this, and having independent studies. So from my perspective of working with developers, it's a long on-running argument around viability of improving energy efficiency and the green credentials of houses. There are some estate agents that believe that if you have, a very green or energy efficient housing, it can add value to your house by, in some cases, up to about 15%. The developer at North Aston argues that they can't put a premium on the houses that they're selling there. They are within the top end of the spectrum of the sort of comparable builds coming in at Vista. But the massive advantage that they are having is that those houses are selling faster, much faster than the comparative, because there's much more demand within the sort of market for people to purchase houses that have a large number of green credentials. And so for them, those are the advantages that they're seeing. But there's, my view is you probably could sell the houses for a little bit of a higher value, but there's no studies that have confirmed that.
Maybe I'll just add one point. You can pretty much bet a few dollars or a few pounds on the fact there's a carbon tax coming, and the changes in EPCs are rapidly approaching, so that if you own properties that you want to rent out, unless they are C-rated, you won't be able to rent them out in the future. And the way that the EPC under the Part L construction changes will mean that renewable energies are critically important for the future. And gas boilers, as you know, new builds can't be installed post 2025. It's coming.
Yeah, so building on what Nigel said, there's already regulations in place for minimum energy efficiency standards. So if you're renting out a property, whether or not it's commercial or domestic, essentially there's a minimum energy efficiency standard of an EPC rating. If you've got an F or a G, unless you've done X, Y, and Z to a property, you're outlawed from renting it out. There are proposals in place currently from central government to raise that standard to a B by 2030, but it hasn't been confirmed into law as far as I'm aware. That predominantly means you have to spend X number of thousands of pounds in improvements to the energy efficiency of a building before you can get an exemption certificate that will last 5 years, and then you have to spend another £5,000 to do so. Those are also sort of what's being sort of coming forward and what's being referred to.
Great, thanks. Derek, you had a question about whether properties can be added to the initial matrix at a later date.
Yeah.
Who wants to pick that up?
Yeah, is that a question for Nigel?
Yeah.
But also, just a couple of other things. And they asked if the land could be used for agriculture where the boreholes are. Again, Nigel, if you could follow up on anything that I haven't got quite right. North Aston used a matrix under sunk in the ground. What depth is that, Nigel? 1.8 meters?
Not quite. No, it's 1 to 1.2 meters typically. Some horizontal loops go to 1.5.
So a varying type of agriculture could take place over the top.
Yes.
If that was the system that was used. And there are other systems that are available, i.e. boreholes, which we understand are quite expensive and probably be at the end of our choice if we had them. Over other sources.
One might want to share on, but basically boreholes are more expensive. Clearly, there's a technology and you've more risk because you might hit aquifers. If you've got to do that, you'll seal them off and all the rest. There's plenty of other issues. There's a lot of
if we were to go to boreholes, they'd be placed, I assume, in strategic places away from agricultural land.
Yeah, yes, because they would have a capping at the top.
Yeah.
They would have to be probably away from reuse of that part of land. But I've not so much experience with boreholes. We've done them, but not to the magnitude of Swaffham Prior.
And something else that came up on Q&A when I was walking around the village, the social distance, might I add, Q&A, that one resident pointed out that where the source is placed, it's very unlikely, if at all, there'd be any development on top of them.
Yes.
So there's something to consider there. If the matrix, whatever we use, is placed between us and any other development locally, that may prevent that. Just on the matrix side of things, Nigel, the group of us so far has said, once, and if you excuse the pun, no stone will be unturned. But once the trenches are open, then we will make 110% of effort to refill those trenches with anything the village needs at the time, i.e. fibre band and anything that might be current going forward. So it won't be just a case of joining up the potholes in the village to lay the matrix in. So
there'll be specification of the type of trench, the width, the depth, and all the rest for the services.
For sure.
But yes, you can put pretty much any service in the same trench if it's wide enough or deep enough.
So that then leads on. Sorry, Nigel, to dance about. If a property chooses to join the system, albeit considered that there's enough capacity in the system after the initial matrix is put in, is that possible?
It is, providing that you have future-proofed as far as you are able the heat mains. So it's sizing them. I mean, clearly, if you've got a heat main that's serving 30 properties, for example, of one leg, and you size it for those 30 properties, if you want to add another 10 on, that becomes difficult.
Yeah.
If you want to add 1 on, 2 on, it's entirely possible, leaving the right basically valves but I guess you'd want to know at the point you're doing it that it's probable that particular property or small number of properties may want to come on at a later date.
Sure, I'm just thinking, and like Mike has said in Swaffham, they've built for capacity, they've overbuilt over capacity for supply. I'm just thinking, for example, if you take a terrace of houses, if houses 1, 3, and 7 initially sign up for the initial supply, and at a later date, houses 2 and 5 are bought by other people and want to join, can they manifold on outside their front doors? Can you join the system? Can you at a later date?
I think Mike's already alluded to this, and I'll pass over to Mike in a moment, but basically you can, but there's an engineering cost to do it.
Of course.
You have to have on the pipe a link that could be connected on, but it will involve digging.
Yes, outside that side, but the actual system itself can be teed into, if you like.
Subject to the capacity, yes. I mean,
yes,
if you've got interest, let's say for, I don't know, let's take 1 megawatt, and then you size it for 1.2 megawatts to give some allowance for future proofing, but then you find that there's a requirement 1.5, you might struggle because unless you over invested massively at the beginning.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, I'm not sure whether you could add to that because obviously you've got experience at Swaffham. He's disappeared off my screen. I'm not sure he's. No, maybe he's gone.
Maybe I can chip in from experiences on some of the other developments. So yeah, some of the other heat networks, particularly developers as they're building out in multiple stages, the energy storage, the energy centre, as they are, quite often, if they know they're going to need additional capacity, they build quite a substantial energy centre so that they can add additional plant as is needed. As Nigel's said, there is limiting capacities in sometimes in terms of the plant and the air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps as they are, or alternatively the physical amount of energy you can get down the pipes and the size of the pipes. So that there are a sort of a number of limitations as and when they are. I think in designing a scheme, and part of that is the feasibility study, you can build in as much flexibility as you can, but there is always a limit.
I'm just wondering if we should explain a little bit about the process of so the stage that we're at now is stage 1, which is we're applying to the Rural Heat Fund.
Rural Community Energy Fund.
There you go. RECF. I knew what it was, but I didn't. Anyway, so we're applying for £40,000 to do a feasibility survey, which would look at the land and look at our village and kind of look at the demand and the need. And then after that, it will ascertain whether it would be a good thing for us to progress or whether there's no point and we cease. Hopefully they think it's a good thing and we progress. And at that point, I think then we look at kind of the more intricate details about the size of the heat centre we'll need and the logistics of how the connections work. Is that right?
I'm quite happy to jump in unless, so there's a variety of different funding streams out there. So the Rural Community Energy Fund is very much primed and easy to tag onto as a community group to do this initial feasibility funding. There is a second stage of the Rural Community Energy Fund, which is more of for taking it forward for project delivery. Additionally, there is something called the Heat Network Delivery Unit, which is a Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, a central government team that specifically look at heat networks. And they've got a series of, they've broken it down almost into 5 different stages of feasibility. So the first stage is what's called mapping and master planning, but that's for a wider area and is not really relevant to here. The stage that would be next is a high level sort of economic feasibility. And then followed by that, it is a more detailed feasibility taken to what's considered a government green book analysis. And that really is the final feasibility stage, where you've got a solid business case for which people can invest into. The Rural Community Energy Fund and how it matches up with these 2 different stages is it kind of overlaps between the 2, but doesn't quite bring it to a green book standard. So essentially, when we come to the end of the RCEF fund, there's a couple of different routes open to us, and it's a discussion to be had about what's the more sensible route to take, looking at getting to the end result, just because there's different requirements associated with both. But without knowing what the outcome of the feasibility is, it's almost impossible to say you should go down this route or you should go down this route. So suffice to say is that there's a few options available, but we'll be here to help and guide.
Thanks, Sam. We've got 2 more questions in the chat that I want to come to, and then we should probably close off the meeting, give people some more of the Wednesday evening back. So there was one from Deborah Jones. I think, Deborah, your question's around the total cost of the project for the village to be connected. Obviously, there's a few variables and parameters in here, but maybe we can talk in general terms about the total cost, which, you know, just to remind everyone, this would be hopefully covered by grant funding rather than anyone needing to put their hands in their pockets for that upfront cost. Or at least that's the Swaffham model.
Do you want me to pick up just very briefly? I mean, I understand the Swaffham model because of the fact they were breaking new ground, pardon the pun. Their total budget is somewhere in the order of 9 million. I believe that you're, based upon experience and practical experience, subject to which type of organisations need to be involved in this and whether their roster for councils or government, that cost should come down, and probably could come down by at least half. But it's going to depend on what the requirements are to meet the obligations of county councils and such like. So it's yet to be known, but it cannot be anywhere near what Swaffham had to endure, if you like, with breaking new ground.
Yeah, I think you're right, Nigel. If I had to guess what your scheme is going to cost without knowing what the technology is, I'd say probably about 5 million, maybe, about there. And sorry, my internet dropped out because we haven't got fibre optic yet. But
you were just avoiding the question, weren't you?
But there were a couple of points that I didn't manage to answer with Derek because I disappeared. But we're designing the network so that there are T-junctions, dog legs at each home. So even if they're not signing up, if they do want to sign up at a later stage, it's enabled so that we at least don't have to cut too much of the pipe work. It's already there, so it's just capped off as an end. The other one was around the boreholes and agricultural use. The county council land is arable at the moment, and when we put the boreholes in, we'll convert it to a permanent pasture. So it will still be agricultural, but it will change. So we're not going to have any ploughing or anything like that on there because of all the equipment under the ground. But I mean, to be honest, and not trying to second guess your technical feasibility, but I would expect that you're probably not going to go for deep boreholes. You've got the river and the canal, so a water source heat pump and an air source heat pump would do exactly the same as our scheme will do with the ground source, but it will be cheaper because you don't have to drill 130 boreholes, which is very expensive.
Okay. And then we've got some questions from Marcus, which I might summarise as, why don't we just extend the gas network throughout the rest of the village? I don't know if anyone wants to.
Yeah,
I'm hoping someone would like to pick that up. Sam.
Yeah, so essentially the process is not too dissimilar in terms of extending the gas network and putting in heat network for sort of communication with residents. It is a conversation that could be had with Southern Gas Networks, but whereas there's grant funding available to do a heat network and a fairly solid business case potentially behind it, with an extension to Southern Gas Network, they will fund part of it. However, that will only go so far, and where the additional costs would be looked to be picked up from Southern Gas Network, they typically would charge a fee to the households, and quite often that fee is depending on the way that they go about doing it, is quite often they need a minimum of 60% of the village, depending on how much of the gas is going to be used and the size of the pipes. I've seen fees go to about £5-6 grand per household to extend the gas network. I've seen some fees go up to 10 to 15k as an example, which nobody's really paid for. But there will be an upfront cost essentially to the households to do that. Southern Gas Network will not do it for free.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that people across the high street have recently had a quote, and it was far in excess of the top end of your range there, Sam, for extending to the existing gas network to them.
Yeah, hi Andy, I don't know if I can come in there. Sorry, you can't see me for some reason tonight, but we had an individual quote 2 weeks ago at the top of the high street, £40,000. That was Southern Gas Network, for us to be connected individually ourselves, obviously not as a group, as a village.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. That's really helpful. Right, I think that's all of the questions that we've got. I think I'd like to give people their Wednesday evening back. I'd just like to thank people from outside the village who've given up time on a Wednesday evening that they really didn't have to. So thank you very much to Mike for talking us through the Swaffham scheme, to Sam for giving us his time from Cherwell District Council, and for Nigel for giving us his technical expertise. But guys, we really do appreciate you taking the time. It's massively beneficial to everyone. So thank you, everyone. And also thanks to people in the village for coming along and spending time with us. We really appreciate it. It's great to see all of you. Thanks for asking us your questions. Charlie's already put the email address of the group into the chat. So please do send us emails in and keep asking questions. And just reiterate, the reason we would do something is because people in the village want it, and that's the only reason that anything would move forward here. But thanks everyone, really appreciate your time.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you very much. All the best.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye
Good
bye.
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 Night.
Bye.
Night.
Andy, should we stay on just for a moment? If we've got a moment.
Yeah.